The fast food drive-thru was packed, a snake of cars stretching all the way out of the parking lot. Everyone there had one thing in common. They were hungry, tired, and trying to keep their patience. Everyone except her. She was driving a giant SUV, the kind that looked like it was built for crossing deserts, climbing mountains, and, apparently, skipping queues at drive-thrus. The woman stepped on the accelerator impatiently, moving millimeters forward as if the queue was going to dissolve out of sheer intimidation. The chaos began when she decided that waiting was an optional concept. As the cars moved forward one by one, respecting the natural order of things, she abruptly turned the wheel and tried to squeeze between two vehicles that had already been in the queue for ages, as if no one would notice a 2-ton metal monster simply springing out of nowhere. The horn of the car next to him sounded almost at the same time as a muffled scream from someone inside the vehicle. "What the p—" The woman inside the SUV didn't even blink. In her mind, that was a divine right. The other drivers began to realize what was happening. Heads leaned out of the windows, fingers were pointed, expressions of disbelief formed on the rearview mirrors. No one liked a line breaker, especially when everyone was at their wits' end after a long day. But she didn't care. With a sudden movement, she threw the car even further forward, almost pressing a Honda Civic against the side of the drive-thru. It was as if she believed that if she pushed hard enough, the queue would magically rearrange itself around her urgent need for a burger. It was at that moment that the drive-thru attendant noticed the confusion. A teenager wearing a red cap and looking like he'd seen too much for his young age appeared at the cashier's window. He looked at the woman in the SUV, looked at the queue, and after a second of contemplation, he picked up the microphone and spoke into the sound system. "Attention, people in line. We have a special female driver here who thinks she can ignore all the laws of civilization." The entire drive-thru erupted in murmurs and laughter. People inside the cars started recording with their cell phones, some even narrating as if it were a wildlife documentary. The woman huffed, gesturing furiously inside the SUV. She rolled down her window violently, ready to unleash her fury on the attendant, but he just smiled. The kind of smile that says, "I earn too little to put up with this, but I'm going to have fun anyway." What he did next, however, made everyone there realize that this story was far from over. The woman in the SUV looked at the attendant as if he had just spat on the United States flag. Her face turned red with rage, and, if there was a scandal thermometer, the temperature would have gone beyond "complain to the manager" to "call the police because the store refused your expired coupon." She punched the electric window button and screamed, "This is absurd! I have the right to be served!" But the attendant, who seemed to have made a pact with his own cynicism, just tilted his head to one side, feigning deep contemplation. "Wow, what a complicated situation, huh?" he said into the drive-thru microphone so that everyone could hear. "But you see, here, in the civilized world, we have something called FILA. Cars started honking in support. Some people were laughing so loudly that you could hear them from across the parking lot. A guy in a Corolla was filming everything and said, "That goes to TikTok, brother." The woman, however, wasn't finding it funny at all. She was snorting inside the SUV like a bull about to charge. She turned the steering wheel from side to side, trying to intimidate the car next to her, as if at any moment she was going to crush someone just for the right to grab a giant combo before the others. Only the attendant decided he wasn't going to let it go. "Well, guys, since we've got a VIP customer here who thinks she can jump the queue, here's what we're going to do." He paused dramatically, turned to enter the restaurant, and called the manager. The manager, a middle-aged man with the expression of someone who has seen more shenanigans than he'd like, appeared at the small window and crossed his arms. "What's the matter?" he asked. The attendant pointed with his chin at the giant SUV. "We have a distinguished lady here who thinks that waiting like everyone else is not something that applies to her." The manager looked at the scene, looked at the cars in the queue, looked back at the attendant. Then, with a mischievous glint in his eyes, he picked up the microphone and announced to the entire queue, "Attention, drive-through customers! Right now, we're going to take a break." The noise in the queue was replaced by incredulous silence. The restaurant is offering a minute's silence to honor the warriors of patience, those who respect the order of things and wait like everyone else. The woman in the SUV widened her eyes as if someone had just announced that the fast food restaurant now only served vegan food. "What? And more," the manager continued. "As a protest against people who cut in line, we're going to serve every car twice before we serve this SUV." The queue went wild. People honked their horns, clapped their hands. Someone in a pickup truck even stuck his head out and shouted, "I love you, manager!" The woman inside the SUV looked like she was going to have an aneurysm. She punched the steering wheel, shouted something unintelligible, and tried to push the car forward as if, by sheer force of will, she would be able to drive the other drivers away. But now, the game was against her. The attendant looked directly at the woman and gave her a satisfied smile. "Oh, and just to make sure, if you keep trying to cut in line, we'll cancel your order." Her expression changed from pure anger to absolute horror. Cancel the order? That was a war crime. But instead of backing down, she did the unthinkable. She shifted into reverse, hit the gas hard, and tried to rethink her strategy. If she couldn't beat the queue in the traditional way, perhaps she could get in another way. But, in her desperation to avoid embarrassment, she didn't notice a small detail. Behind her, a policeman standing in line at the drive-thru was watching everything. And now, with the new uncontrolled maneuver, he decided it was time to go down in history. The roar of the SUV's engine was followed by the dry sound of tires singing on the asphalt. The woman was trying to back up, perhaps trying a new strategy, or just running away from the absolute embarrassment that had become her existence. But what she didn't realize, or rather refused to realize, was that right behind her was a police car. And not just any police car. It was one of those sturdy models with its black and white paintwork shining under the parking lot lights, and a policeman who, it seemed, just wanted to get his snack and finish his shift. But now he had a new priority: dealing with the mythological creature known as the woman who thinks she owns the world. The back of the SUV came to a stop just a few centimeters from the bumper of the police car. It was a close call. A second more, and we would have had a crime in progress. But what really sealed her fate was the look of sheer exhaustion on the policeman's face, as he slowly picked up the radio and said something before opening the door and getting out of the car. Silence spread through the drive-thru. The people in line were paralyzed between the emotion of seeing justice done and the desire to pull out a popcorn and watch it as if it were a live show. The woman, on the other hand, still didn't seem to understand that her game was up. The policeman, a man with a firm build and the expression of someone who had put up with a lot of unbearable people in his life, walked up to the SUV window and knocked on the glass. She didn't immediately roll it down. Of course she didn't. She stood there, staring at the man as if he were a nuisance, an inconvenience on her way to the sacred hamburger. Eventually, snorting like a bull about to charge, she pressed the button and the glass went down just a few centimeters, enough for the policeman to hear her first defense argument. "I didn't do anything wrong." If there was one phrase that was guaranteed to make any policeman roll his eyes to the back of his head, it was this one. The man took a deep breath, leaned in slightly, and, with the patience of a teacher dealing with a particularly unbearable child, asked, "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" The woman crossed her arms, throwing her head back as if she were the victim of a cosmic injustice. "I'm just trying to make a request. These useless employees are treating me badly, so I had to make do." The sentence hung in the air like a gas balloon filled with pure sass. Inside, the drive-thru attendant, who was still holding the microphone, decided he wasn't going to miss his chance. "I heard that, okay? And you were the one trying to cut in line." The policeman raised an eyebrow. "Cutting in line? I didn't cut in line," she shouted, now as red as a bell pepper. But before she could continue her litany, the policeman took a step back and pointed to the side of the restaurant where at least 3 people were holding cell phones, recording everything. Some of them were waving enthusiastically, as if to say, "Yes, we have proof. Yes, this is going to be hilarious on the internet." The woman looked at the cell phones, then at the policeman, and for the first time seemed to hesitate. Maybe, just maybe, she had realized that the hole she had dug herself into was too deep to climb out of without consequences. The policeman crossed his arms. "Can I have your driver's license, please?" Her expression contorted into pure despair. She knew that if she handed over her wallet, she was assuming that she had done something wrong. And accept a mistake? Not in a million years. So she did what any completely clueless person would do. She tried to speed up and get out of there. The problem? She was inside a drive-thru. The policeman sighed deeply. It was the kind of sigh that said, "I wish I was at home watching TV right now, but here I am, dealing with this bullshit. Turn off the car." Now finally, with a sudden movement, she turned off the car and threw her hands on the steering wheel. Defeated, the policeman held out his hand again. Driver's license. Slowly, with clenched teeth and the expression of someone who had just chewed an entire lemon, she pulled out her purse and handed over the document. The policeman took it, gave her one last look, and said something that made everyone burst out laughing. "I hope your request is worth it, because this night is going to be very expensive." If regret had a smell, it would be the smell of cold frying and gasoline evaporating on the hot asphalt, as the woman sank deeper and deeper into her own stupidity. Sitting inside the SUV, she was now reduced to a completely defeated human being, watching the policeman flip through her driver's license as if looking for the last shred of dignity left in her. Meanwhile, the drive-thru had turned into an event. Some drivers had turned off their cars and were watching the scene as if it were an outdoor movie. The attendant, who was clearly enjoying every second, leaned his elbows on the counter and muttered to his co-workers, "I bet this story will be on the news." And maybe he was right, because someone across the street was already doing an Instagram live with the caption, "Woman loses line at drive-thru and gets hurt." The woman looked around and saw cell phones pointed at her. Her expression quickly turned from anger to something close to despair. It wasn't possible that this was happening. She, who had walked in with the absolute certainty that the world revolved around her, was now just another meme in the making. But the policeman wasn't finished with her yet. "Do you have any idea how many offenses you've committed?" She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. For the first time since the beginning of the fiasco, it seemed that her brain was processing the real consequences of what she had done. The policeman held up a finger and began to list. Dangerous driving, attempting to cut in line, causing a risk of collision, disobeying an officer, and, of course, disturbing public order. With each item, the woman wilted a little more. It was as if each infraction was a brick being placed on top of her, building a wall of pure embarrassment from which she could no longer escape. But it was when the policeman picked up the ticket book that the humiliation reached its peak. "Are you going to fine me?" she choked, finally managing to speak, but in a completely different voice. It was no longer the voice of the arrogant person who tried to push cars to get the upper hand. Now it was the voice of someone who realized, too late, that she had played with the patience of the universe. The policeman looked at her as if he were facing the dumbest question he'd ever heard in his life. "Not only am I going to give you a ticket, I'm going to tow the car away." The reaction was instantaneous. "You can't do that." "I can and I will," said the policeman, reaching for the radio to call the tow truck. The woman struggled inside the car, as if trying to find a magic button that would get her out of the situation. But there was no button. There was no way out. There was just her arrogance, and a car that, in a few minutes, would be dragged away while she tried to explain to someone on the phone how everything had gone so wrong. On the other side of the drive-thru, the restaurant manager decided to make his final contribution to the show. He took the microphone and announced, "Everyone, While the tow truck isn't here, we're going to offer a special gift to our patient customers. Everyone in line gets a free potato. The drive-thru erupted in applause. Minutes later, the tow truck arrived. The policeman signaled for her to get out of the car. "You may step down, ma'am." She hesitated. It was her last moment before the complete destruction of her reputation. But there was no choice. She opened the door slowly and climbed down, her arms crossed and her chin held high, trying desperately to save what was left of her dignity. But it didn't work. Just as her feet touched the ground, someone in the queue lowered the glass and shouted, "Hey, do you want us to order your snack in the meantime?" The whole restaurant burst out laughing. And then, finally, the woman did what she should have done all along. She put her head down and walked away, without looking back, as the tow truck took away her SUV, and along with it, the last illusion that the world revolved around her.